بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. قال رحمه الله تعالى وأما الأسباب الباطنة فهي أشد. So now he speaks about the major issues or major ailments that lead to a disrupted prayer. He says that they are worse or more severe than the minor ones. Of course, he says فإن من تشعبت به الهموم في أودية الدنيا لا ينحصر فكره في فن واحد. So the person who basically his interests and his concerns have branched out into various parts of the dunya, then this person, his thoughts are not going to be in relation to one particular area. So a person who has his hand in multiple parts of this life, his thoughts are going to likewise follow his hand. And he says, بل لا يزال يطير من جانب إلى جانب وغض البصر لا يغني. So this person, he's going to be going from one place to another place, one thought to another thought. And simply lowering the gaze is not going to help this person. Why? Because the person is not distracted by what's in front of him. He's distracted by what, to a degree, is behind him, i.e. the dunya. He's left the dunya outside of the masjid, but it's followed him into the masjid. And this is perhaps, unfortunately, going to be more relevant to us than previous generations, although that's an assumption. But why? Because especially if you live in a modern society, modern societies require that you are busy most of the time, the fast life. So you're thinking about work, you're thinking about accommodation, you're thinking about bills, you're thinking about other bills, you're thinking about family members perhaps, you're thinking about so many different things. And we're kind of raised to think about various things. And if you add to that today, a topic that we touched upon last week, the notion of a high value man, materialism basically, that a man is worth the material that he acquires, i.e. the financial wealth that he acquires, the possessions that he acquires, the status that he may acquire, then this becomes even more severe. Why? Because a person's thoughts are going to be in so many different things. He's not only concerned about what he's doing now and where his hands are now, he's going to be concerned with where he can potentially place his hands tomorrow, or he's going to be concerned with what's going to happen tomorrow. And so we live in a time where really it is a wheel constantly running, just constantly running. There's no stopping. And so when a person comes to the salah, their mind is going to be preoccupied with everything other than the salah. He says, فَهَذَا طَرِيقُهُ أَن يَرُدَّ النَّفْسَ قَهْرًا إِلَى فَهْمِ مَا يَقْرَؤُهُ فِي الصَّلَاةِ أو ما يقرأه في الصلاة. He says, basically in brief, the cure for this person is that he forcibly brings himself back to reflecting over what is being read in the salah. So if we imagine someone is reading Surah Al-Fatiha and then reading Surah Al-Asr, for example, and his thoughts start to drift, he brings himself back. He tries to reflect over the meanings contained within Surah Al-Fatiha. And based upon his understanding of the Arabic language will be the depth of his reflection, his thought. Likewise, Surah Al-Asr, same thing. So, وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ. He's thinking about these things as he's in the salah. And this shows us the importance of the language. The importance of the language. So now, if I don't understand the Arabic language and I'm listening to the Imam, or I'm reciting myself, what exactly am I going to use to bring me back into the prayer, to force myself into the prayer? And we all have an opportunity to learn the Arabic language. The Arabic language is the language of Islam and the language of the Quran. And it's very important that we learn the Arabic language and that we develop a culture of learning the Arabic language. And we have in the UK and Europe various ethnic groups, various communities, whether they are considered to be, majority Muslim ethnic groups, or they are ethnic groups that have now joined Islam. So, for example, reverts, they would fall, you have English, Caribbean, African, those that come from the subcontinent, so on and so forth. And then you have predominantly Muslim ethnic groups, Eastern African, Western African, Northern African, Middle Eastern, etc. All of the groups that live here as Muslims in the UK and Europe, the Arabic language should be what brings them together. It should be what brings us together, I should say. But unfortunately, it's not the case. We have become, I guess, negligent when it comes to the Arabic language. We're quite negligent of the Arabic language in the West. And it leaves us in a very weak position. Why? Because if we learn the Arabic language as a community, we have a direct attachment to the Quran, to the Sunnah, and to the works of the ulama as-sabiqeen, the ulama who formulated for us what our deen is. And so no matter what we hear in the media, no matter what we hear from individuals or organizations or groups that want to take us away from Islam, whether internally or externally, we have a direct link to the sources. And so, for example, you have a silly debate, that's raging in society about whatever it might be. You go to the Quran, you open the Quran, and you find Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is very clear about this issue. And so it brings clarity, it brings direction. And if you look in academia today, especially academia, and it's like Islamic academia, i.e. academia in the West, so-called Islamic studies, many of these academics don't even understand Arabic language. They're talking about topics and they're debating topics and researching topics, and they don't even understand the Arabic language. And that's why you hear the strangest of opinions coming from them. Because if they understood the Arabic language, they would understand how fallacious their views are. They would understand how ridiculous their views are, because there's no way they can attach those views to Islam if they understood the Arabic language. The language itself doesn't allow for these views to exist. And likewise, when you learn the Arabic language, you come to appreciate the depth of the Quran. You come to appreciate how deep the Arabic language is. When you understand the grammar, you understand, the way that words change and the sarf, etc. You understand, you start to question, how is it possible a man came up with such a language himself? And it goes into theological discussions and so on and so forth. You start to appreciate. And the Quran, it's no longer just a melody that you hear. It's no longer just a melody that you hear. And one of the reasons perhaps why we're so obsessed with the melodious tones of reciters in the West is because we don't understand the Quran. If you understand the Quran, it doesn't matter how melodious the Imam is in his recitation. The words are enough. The words are enough. And the Quran was revealed to us to be read and understood, not to be read with melody and that's it. Not to suggest that melody is not important. When I say melody, tajweed and reciting in a beautiful manner, etc. There's nothing wrong with that as long as it's within the framework. But the point is, that's not going to bring you back to the salah. It's not going to bring you back to the salah when your thoughts are drifting. So that's the first thing he says. He says to force yourself back to the prayer by understanding the words that are being recited. So if you don't understand the Arabic language, that's the starting point. That's the starting point. If you want to have a present heart in the salah, learn the Arabic language. And there are no shortcuts. In life, there are no shortcuts, and in the deen, there are no shortcuts. You cannot start today and be a mu'min tomorrow. You can have iman, yes, but when I say mu'min, as in have strong iman, you have to work your way up slowly but surely. So you can't take shortcuts. If you want to understand, you have to learn. And he says, وَيُشْغِلُهَا بِهِ عَنْ غَيْرِهِ وَيُعِينُهُ عَلَى ذَلِكَ. And he says, so he busies himself with the salah, with the qira'ah on anything else. So he uses that it becomes his anchor. He ties himself to the recitation of the Quran, whether his own or that of the Imam. Then he says, وَيُعِينُهُ عَلَى ذَلِكَ أَن يَسْتَعِدَّ لَهُ قَبْلَ التَّحْرِيمِ بأن يجدد على نفسه ذكر الآخرة وموقف المناجاة وخطر المقام بين يدي الله سبحانه وتعالى وهول المطلع ويفرق قلبه قبل التحريم. So he says he can help himself by starting before the salah. How? Prior to the tahrim. So the tahrim being Allahu Akbar, making that which is usually halal for him haram whilst in a state of prayer, talking, drinking, eating, moving around, etc. He starts prior to the salah by reminding himself of the akhirah, by reminding himself of standing in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the salah and asking, because that's what we're doing. The salah is a munajah. It's a form of asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When you're not asking with your words, when you're not reciting al-Fatiha or reciting dua, etc., you're asking with your body. You're saying, Ya Rab, I'm standing here, accept from me. Ya Rab, look at me. Ya Rab, be pleased with me. You're asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so he says, you remind yourself of the akhirah, number one. Number two, you remind yourself of the fact that you are standing in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And on that point, perhaps something to reflect upon. And I think we did discuss it, briefly, the way that we dress when we come to the masjid. If you imagine you're going to visit a king, no person would turn up in scruffy clothes, pajamas, for example, things like that. Most people would turn up and they look presentable. What does presentable mean? That's based upon customs and norms and culture, etc. But it's important when coming to the masjid that we wear clothes which are respectable. Wear respectable clothes. He says, by reminding yourself you're standing in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he says, وَخَطْرَ الْمَقَامِ بَيْنَ يَدَيِ اللَّهِ subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the basically the intensity or the severity of the fact that you're standing in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's like amrun khatir. It's something which is not an easy thing. I believe one of the Sahaba, one of the Tabi'een, I forget now, but when he used to make wudu, his face used to change color. And they asked him, why does your face change color when you're performing wudu? And he used to say, because you know who I'm going to stand in front of right now. If you knew who you were going to stand in front of, you would be nervous. You wouldn't be comfortable with standing in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And just as we stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the salah, we're going to stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on Yawm al-Qiyamah. It's a severe issue. It's an important, very important, the most important thing. And one salah will be our last salah. One of the prayers that we pray will end up being our last prayer. Because each and every one of us, we're going to die in between one of two prayers. That's a reality. And so one of the prayers that we pray is going to be our last. And so we don't want the last prayer that we potentially pray to be one that we didn't give any attention to, that we didn't take seriously. And so it's a great, when you really think about it, the salah is not something easy. It should be something intense and something that we take seriously. The Sahaba, as the ulama they mentioned, they used to, when someone missed a salah, it was as if they lost a family member, That's how severe it was to them. He says, وَهَوْلَ الْمَطْلِعِ, the enormity, basically, of what is about to commence, the enormity of the salah, whether it's the event of the prayer, everyone standing together, or the event of Yawm al-Qiyamah, everyone standing together in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, both are enormous. The salah precedes Yawm al-Qiyamah, and the salah is a mini reminder of Yawm al-Qiyamah. And when you think about it, subhanAllah, it's amazing. Especially if you pray at the front, if you lead a salah and you turn around and you look, unless you know the individuals, you cannot tell the rich from the poor, the healthy from the sick. You can't tell where people come from unless they have particular, facial features that make it obvious. All of those things become irrelevant in salah. Why? Because you're standing next to random people, etc. And it should remind us of Yawm al-Qiyamah. On Yawm al-Qiyamah, we're going to stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Everyone is the same. Everyone is the same. Likewise, on Arafah, the ulama, they mention on Arafah the same thing. When you look on Arafah, everyone's wearing, the ihram, white ihram, and standing, begging Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In Hajj, you can't tell the difference between the rich and the poor, high status and low status, sick and healthy. Everyone looks the same. And so likewise in the salah. In the salah, the best of us are those whose hearts are attached to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, irrelevant of their status in this dunya. And so then he says, وَيُفْرِقْ قَلْبَهُ قَبْلَ التَّحْرِيمِ بِالصَّلَاةِ عَمَّا يُهِمُّ. And likewise, so the third point, so the first point is to learn the Arabic language for those that don't know it, and to use the Arabic language, i.e. their understanding of the Quran, to bring them back to the salah when their thoughts are drifting. That's the first point. The second point, to remember the reason that we're praying, basically, because we're going to stand in front of Allah, etc. The third point, he says, وَيُفْرِقْ قَلْبَهُ قَبْلَ التَّحْرِيمِ بِالصَّلَاةِ عَمَّا يُهِمُّ. That a person should empty their heart of that which their heart is concerned with prior to the prayer. And that's the importance of coming to the prayer early. Coming to the prayer, for the adhan, for example, or trying to be in the masjid earlier than the salah. And the purpose behind it is not to sit around and wait as if we have nothing to do. It's to busy ourselves with dhikr, with qira'atul Quran, remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so that when the salah starts, we're ready for the prayer and our heart is ready to stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as well as the body. And there's an issue here that we'll speak about shortly. He says, فَلَا يَتْرُكْ لِنَفْسِهِ شُغَلًا يَلْتَفِتُ إِلَيْهِ خَاطِرُ. So he doesn't allow for himself anything that will basically take his thoughts away from the salah. He doesn't allow for himself that which will busy him and busy his thoughts from the prayer. He tries to empty his heart of all of those things. So he leaves behind the ham and the gham of this dunya. He leaves behind his concerns of what's gone by and his concern for what's coming. And he focuses on the present, which is standing with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that in and of itself is a form of, if you want to call it, therapy. Why? Because you're detaching yourself from your concerns. You're detaching yourself from that which busies your thoughts of your past and that which busies your mind of your future. You're cutting all of those things off and you're turning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and you're being present in the moment. Today they have things such as mindfulness, mindfulness, being, mindful of nothing, basically, emptying your mind of everything except, I guess, yourself. But the salah, we attach ourselves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and we cut everything else off. Like the Muslim who prays properly doesn't need to engage in mindfulness practices. The Muslim is mindful. The Muslim who prays properly is mindful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Mindful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refers to the believers in the Quran, الذاكرين الله كثيرا والذاكرات, those who are oft in remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of men and women. And so the salah is a form of alleviation. And the Prophet ﷺ, he used to say to Bilal radiallahu anhu, أرحنا بالصلاة يا Bilal, bring ease to us with the prayer, O Bilal. Like when he used to ask him to call the adhan or the iqamah, he used to say أرحنا يا Bilal, like bring us comfort, bring us ease. Why? Because the salah is raha. It brings comfort and ease to the heart of the believer because it cuts him off from this dunya. And this dunya, it's a test. And a test obviously is not going to be easy. And so it's going to bring stress, it's going to bring anxiety, it's going to bring pressure, it's going to bring all of those things. And so the salah is an escape, reminding yourself this place is only temporary and I'm going to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And especially for the one who's preparing for that, it's going to be something that he looks forward to. Then he says, فإن كان لا يسكن هوائج أفكاره بهذا الدواء المسكن فلا ينجيه إلا. He says, if basically his scattered thoughts, his concerns are not alleviated through that which was aforementioned, then the only thing that will help him is basically to completely remove that which leads to the thoughts and the concerns and the distractions in his prayer. So to completely remove the causes of such things. If you cannot remove the thoughts, etc., then you remove the things which cause the thoughts. And I mean, you can think about it in our time today. We can think about some of these things. He says, الذي يقمع مادة الداء من أعماق العروق وهو أن ينظر إلى الأمور الصارفة الشاغلة عن إحضار القلب فيعاقب نفسه بالنزوع عن تلك الشهوات. So he says basically to look to the thoughts and to find out where they're coming from and to then punish himself by removing the ability to fulfill those desires. So for example, if a person, let's say they enjoy eating, and in the salah, they're thinking about food, then the punishment will be not to allow himself to eat for the day, for example. So it's to tame the nafs. So the ulama, you'll often find that they speak about the nafs as if they're speaking about, as if there are two people inside you. And the nafs is the one that needs to be tamed, and the soul, or the good part of you, is the one that tames. But so it's like taming a young child. perhaps that's not the best way of saying it, but disciplining a young child. If a young child doesn't listen, you can say, I'm going to take this away from you. You need to learn to respect your parents, respect your elders. You need to listen, and so on and so forth. Although today, subhanallah, unfortunately, society wants children that are unruly, children that are undisciplined, and the parents are the ones that are disciplined by the children nowadays. But the point is, anyway, is that you tame yourself, you discipline yourself by punishing yourself. And he mentioned some examples, and this removes the cause from the depths of your body, basically. So he says, فَيُعَاقِبْ نَفْسَهُ بِالنُّزُوعِ عَنْ تِلْكَ الشَّهَوَاتِ وَقَطْعُ تِلْكَ الْعَلَائِقِ. And so he cuts off the attachment that he has to those things. He cuts himself off completely. And you will find, if you look at the ulama of the past, especially the ulama that were concerned with the state of the heart, those that, for example, Imam al-Ghazali, those are authored in as-suluk, etc. You'll find that this is what they would. Imam al-Ghazali himself, he cut himself off from the dunya. He went away for a decade or so, and he took himself out of the situation of being concerned with status, wealth, all of those things, and he went and he lived as an unknown person until people realized who he was, and he came back a changed man. And so I would recommend, if you want to read more about it, read his autobiography, which is al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, so deliverance from error. He says, فَكُلُّ مَا يُشْغِلُهُ عَنْ صَلَاتِهِ فَهُوَ ضِدُّ دِينِهِ. So now listen to what he says. And this is a very perhaps controversial statement when we think about it in our time today. He says, everything which busies him from his prayer is actually an opponent of his deen. So everything that busies a man or a woman from the prayer is an opponent of the deen. And the ulama, they say, ad-dunya and al-akhirah, they don't come together in one heart. The more you incline towards the dunya, the less you will be inclined towards the akhirah. The more you incline towards the akhirah, the less you will be inclined towards the dunya. You cannot incline towards the dunya and incline towards the akhirah at the same time. It's not possible. It's not possible. One has to overcome the other. And so anything which busies you from your salah is considered to be an opponent of your deen, by Imam al-Ghazali. He says, فَإِمْسَاكُهُ أَضَرُّ عَلَيْهِ مِنْ إِخْرَاجِهِ. And so holding on to it is worse and more harmful for this person than letting go of it. Why? Because when you let go of certain things, sometimes there are to be consequences. So, for example, Imam al-Ghazali, he says in Bidayatul Hidayah, for those of you that have read it or were here when we were reading it, he says that if a person can suffice with a loaf of bread and some olive oil daily, then he should do so. Why? Because it's better for his deen. It's easier for him to cut off from the dunya completely. And of course, it's not something we can do in our time today. I'm personally not suggesting that. Why? Because we're living in a completely different circumstance. The point that he's making is that you suffice yourself with the same food and the easiest type of food daily. The staple food of your living place, and that's it. You don't concern yourself with the tastes and the luxuries of eating, etc. Why? Because it's easier for you to focus on the akhirah, and you have less distractions from the akhirah, from seeking knowledge and so on and so forth, from worship. Why? Because it's very easy to come across a loaf of bread. You don't need to have much. And in saying that, Imam al-Ghazali, living in a time where once you build your house, that's it. You don't have to pay tax. You don't have to pay water bills. You don't have to pay gas bills. You don't have to pay, lease and fees and so on and so forth. Whereas for us today, the rat race that it is, you're constantly running by design. By design, we're kept running for various reasons. But the point is, previously, if you build your house, you can be poor and have a house. You can be poor and have your own dar. You just won't have anything to eat. But that's easier. Why? Go out, earn a small amount and find something to eat. Whereas today, it's impossible. You have to have sustained income because it's very difficult to have ownership of things, at least in the Western world, the way that we live currently. And even then, if you do have ownership, stability it's not something which is a norm today. So if a person lived in such a state where they can own their house and they don't have to worry about having sustained income, he's saying, cut yourself off from the dunya in Bidayatul Hidayah and focus on your akhirah, focus on your worship, focus on your learning, focus on utilizing what you've been given for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to whatever capacity that is. You know, for some it will be learning, for some it will be other things, which we're not going to go into the details of now. But here he's saying that cutting off that which busies you from your salah is better for you, even though there may be some difficulty in that. There may be difficulty in that. And he says, فَيَتَخَلَّصُ مِنْهُ بِإِخْرَاجِهِ. And so basically he frees himself of the issue that's concerning him in his salah by just getting rid of it. Just completely getting rid of it. And someone might say today, that's extreme. Someone might say that's extreme. So, you know, I've heard people complain that, you know, oh, it's extreme if you tell young people that they shouldn't be spending their money or wasting their money on takeaway and bubble tea and things like this. So imagine, you know, the idea of just completely cutting yourself off from the dunya. But when you look at the Sahaba, you look at the Tabi'een, you look at the ulama of the past, you know, the mujahideen of the past, the awliya of the past, they're there for a reason. These are not stories that we read to make ourselves feel good. They're there to be followed. We're supposed to follow in their way. Following the way of the Sahaba and the way of the Tabi'een is not simply in understanding the theory that comes from you know, their works, etc., or their lives. It's to follow them in practice as well. And so cutting yourself off from the dunya, that should be a goal that we aspire towards one day. And if we can't do it with our hands, we do it with our hearts. Many of the ulama of our time, they cut themselves off from the dunya, but it doesn't prevent them from providing for their families and allowing their families to live, you know, lives that are in line with the lives that people live, average lives in their societies, etc. But they've cut the dunya off from their hearts. And when you do that, it doesn't mean that you have to live as an impoverished person. It doesn't mean you have to be poor. No, you can be wealthy, but you've cut the dunya from your heart. And what happens then? You use the dunya for its function, to serve Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to serve the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the function behind the dunya. The dunya isn't here to be enjoyed. The blunt reality of the dunya, it's not here for enjoyment. Enjoyment is secondary, i.e. it's a blessing that Allah has given us in fulfilling our roles and our purposes here. But our role and our purpose here in this dunya is to serve Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to serve the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's our role and our purpose. So then he says, فَقَدْ رُوِيَ أَنَّهُ لَمَّا لَبِسَ الْخَمِيصَ التي أتاه بها أبو جهم وعليها علم وصلى بها نزعها بعد صلاته وقال عليه الصلاة والسلام اذهبوا بها إلى أبي جهم فإنها ألهتني آنفا عن صلاتي وأتوني بأنبجانية أبي جهم. So I don't know if you have the text, but there's a mistake here. They've switched the noon with the ba in this text. So it's Ambijaniya. And I think in the text is Abnajaniya or something like that. But anyway, so he says, it's narrated that the Prophet ﷺ, he wore a particular type of clothing that was given to him by the Sahabi Abu Jahm, and it had upon it alam is like, you know, signs or I guess drawings of some type. وَصَلَّى بِهَا, and he prayed in it. وَنَزَعَهَا بَعْدَ صَلَاتِهِ, and then he took it off after his salah, and he gave it to those that were with him, and he said, اذهبوا بها إلى أبي جهم فإنها ألهتني آنفا عن صلاتي. It has distracted me whilst I was praying in my prayer. So he took it off and he got rid of it completely. Why? Because it distracted him during the salah. Then he said, and bring me a different type of clothing from Abu Jahm. And the ulama, they say the reason for that is because he doesn't want to, you know, harm Abu Jahm's feelings by rejecting something that he gave to him. So he's asking him to replace it with something else. So think about, that's a type of clothing that the Prophet ﷺ wore. Think about in our lives, what type of distractions do we have? And then think about the mobile phone. The mobile phone. Like the mobile phone, when I say the mobile phone, meaning the smartphone, it makes it so difficult to leave off the dunya, because the entire dunya comes with you. Your social concerns, your family concerns, your business concerns, societal concerns, everything is with you in your pocket. And so even if you're not thinking about it, subconsciously your mind is connected to it. You're in anticipation of the next message or something, of that nature. For those that are addicted to social media, the constant urge to check and to be updated, etc., etc. And so social media and the smartphones are very problematic. And so if a person is going to bring their smartphone to the masjid, the very least they should do is put it on silent and develop the discipline to leave it until they leave the masjid, not to turn it on or to look at it or check things unless it's an emergency. And even then, what would be an emergency? Emergency meaning someone's in dire need of help or something like that. As for, having a conversation over the phone and just talking about random things, it shouldn't happen. Doesn't mean that we don't socialize in the masjid. No, socializing in the masjid, it's a part of being, what the masjid, the purpose behind the masjid. Socializing is an important part of the masjid, but it doesn't become a place of socializing. That's a part. It's not the main, purpose behind it. And the main purpose behind it is what? To pray, to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to see people that are trying to be righteous, to see others, to see Muslims that are praying, Muslims that are reading Quran, Muslims that are engaging in dhikr. Why? Because that has an impact on you as well. It changes you. It encourages you to try to engage in what they're engaging in, etc. So he says, وروي أن أبا طلحة صلى في حائض فأعجبه دبس طرف الشجر يلتمس مخرجا فأتبعه بصره ساعة ثم لم يدري كم صلى فذكر لرسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ما أصابه من الفتنة ثم قال يا رسول الله هو الصدقة فضعه حيث شئت. So he said to, it's narrated that one of the Sahaba, Abu Talha, radiallahu ta'ala, he was praying in a piece of land that he owned, and he saw a particular type of bird that was flying around and trying to find a way out. And so he became intrigued, that it grabbed his attention. And so he started to follow until he returned back to his salah, i.e., mentally, he came back to his salah, and he wasn't sure of how many raka'at he prayed. And so he went to the Prophet ﷺ and he told him, and the word here mentioned, مَا أَصَابَهُ مِنَ الْفِتْنَةِ, the fitna that occurred, that a small bird flying around was considered to be a fitna, a distraction and an issue, etc. And so he said to the Prophet ﷺ that piece of land is now a sadaqah. Do with it what you want, Ya Rasulullah. Why? As a sort of punishment to himself, as a sort of atonement for the fact that he was distracted in his salah due to that. And we know one of the those who were tested, they stayed behind in one of the battles, and they were considered to be from amongst the munafiqeen until Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed that that's not the case, etc. What was it that distracted this individual? It was sitting beneath the shade of a palm tree, sitting beneath the shade of a tree. That was what distracted him. And if you compare that to the type of dunya that we're exposed to, and we become desensitized, we become desensitized to the dunya that we surround ourselves in. And especially our culture today. Our culture today is a culture where we constantly want to be stimulated. We constantly want to be entertained. For many people, it's very difficult to do anything unless there is something entertaining them, some sort of stimulant that they're involved in, whether it's listening to something, watching something, talking to someone. And so it takes you away from your thoughts, from thinking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we have to think about the way that we live. He says, هذا هو الدواء القاطع لمادة العلة. So he says, this is the way that a person can basically alleviate himself from the deficiency or the disorder or the issue of not being able to focus the heart in salah. ولا يغني غيره فأما ما ذكرناه من التلطف بالتسكين فذلك ينفع في الشهوات الضعيفة. He says this is basically the only way that he can alleviate himself of the issue of not being able to concentrate in salah, by cutting off the cause of the distraction itself. And how many of us can do that? It's very difficult. But at least we have to remember that this dunya is a distraction, and, try to cut our concerns off, with this dunya, not to be so distracted and so, not to take the dunya too seriously, to see it as a test. It's a test. Whether I die rich or poor, it's a test. I die sick or healthy, it's a test. Even married, unmarried, it's a test. And the test is to act in accordance to that which is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the circumstance that I find myself in daily. That's it. That's what the test is. So if I wake up tomorrow and I'm sick, how do I respond to that sickness? I wake up tomorrow and I'm rich, how do I respond to that richness, that wealth? I wake up tomorrow and I'm poor, how do I respond to that poverty? That's what the test is. Not to be concerned with the test itself, but to be concerned with the way, am I passing the test? Am I putting the right answers down on the page? He says, as for that which has been mentioned of the lighter method of curing the heart, i.e., Ghaddul Basar, praying in a darkened room, those types of things. He says that's not going to help the person basically whose heart is attached to the dunya. If your heart is attached to the dunya, lowering your gaze is not going to help you. Why? Because the place of the mawdi' al-sujud, or the wall that you're staring at, or the distractions around you, they're not the cause of the distraction. The cause of the distraction is that your heart is attached to this life. And so you need to detach it from this life. And it's difficult, especially when we live in a society which is all about this life. This society is all about this life. This life is the only life that we live, and this life is the main concern, and your value is attached to your position in this life. As for the mu'min, no. A believer's value is attached to the regard that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala holds them in. A believer's value is attached to their place in the akhirah. Then he says, فَأَمَّا الشَّهْوَةُ الْقَوِيَّةُ فَلَا يَنْفَعُ فِيهَا التَّسْكِينُ. So as for the strong shahwa, the strong desire, nothing will benefit except for removing the cause of the desire. Basically, a taskeen is like, it's like a painkiller. A painkiller is not going to help this person. It has to address the underlying issue. It's not going to go away, basically. It's like a person has a cough. And the cough, the cause of the cough, there's no real kind of underlying cause. It's just a cough that comes and goes. Taking cough medicine will help to alleviate the symptoms of the cough. And so for a person who has a simple cough, they can take cough medicine, alleviate the symptoms of the cough, and get on with life. But for the person who has an underlying issue, so for example, the underlying issue might be that they have a type of cancer, or they have a type of lung condition. Trying to address the cough is not going to work. Taking cough medicine is not going to work. Why? Because the cough is not a temporary cough. The cough is a symptom of something which is more severe and underlying. And so the way to get rid of the cough is by getting rid of the underlying issue. And the underlying issue is the love of this life. And the Prophet ﷺ, what did he say when he spoke about the Muslims at the end of times? He said, what makes them weak? Al-wahn. And the Prophet ﷺ described it as being a love of this life and a dislike for death. A love of this life and a dislike for death. And a person may say, is it natural should a person naturally have a want for death? It's not, wanting for death. It's basically not wanting to die because you're attached to this dunya. As for not wanting to die because you're scared, that's natural. It's natural to be scared of death, as in to be scared of the pain, for example, or to be scared of, the consequence of your actions. But holding on to this dunya and not wanting to let go and wanting to remain here forever, which is the way society is today, that's the problem. And that's what's afflicted us, because the dunya has taken a hold of our hearts. And that's what's happening in the salah. And so we have to think about ourselves as individuals and swallow the bitter pill that is understanding and realizing that we are attached to the dunya as an ummah and as individuals, and start to work towards detaching our hearts from the dunya and realizing that everything is a test. We'll conclude with that, inshallah. We'll continue with the next section next week. وصلى اللهم على سيدنا محمد.